It's really not until a woman surrenders to the most primal state that she could possibly embody that her baby can then pass through her into the world. It's also an expression of the most intense beauty and power that you will ever have an opportunity to witness.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Yolande Norris-Clark about how to have a family birth outside the system. Yolande helps families experience birth as a natural, healthy, spiritual process which can be done at home. In this show, we explore the mindset and consciousness that will allow you or your partner to give birth in the best way possible. We also talk about how to handle cultural pressure around birth, the misconceptions that people have about the safety of home birth, and really specific questions like what to do with the placenta afterward. If you're interested in birth, listen to this episode, and you can find our guest Yolande at Bauhauswife on social media, links in the show description, and at her own website, freebirth.ca. But before we get started, let me tell you about our new sponsor. This episode is sponsored by 4Gen. 4Gen's mission as a research organization is to heal the physical and psychological damage inherent to circumcision. To reach this goal, 4Gen has raised funds as a nonprofit in order to conduct research in the field of tissue engineering, which offers outstanding potential to regrow human tissue, especially dermal tissue, lost in trauma. Regrowing the foreskin with all of its functions and benefits will offer men the opportunity to experience their sexuality just as nature intended it. You can learn more by visiting us at 4gen.org. That's FOREGEN.org. Thanks again to 4Gen for sponsoring us. Be sure to check them out. And now, on to the show. The big reason I wanted to talk to you, besides you just seem like a very interesting person, is that in 2 months, me and my wife are having our first baby. We are planning a home birth. We are trying to be as natural as possible, but it's the first time for both of us. So I'm looking to know as much as I can from you, and not just know as much as I can, but also understand the wisdom that might not be in an intellectual form. So I'm glad to have you here and sharing what you know about natural birth with us.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Brendon, and congratulations to you and your wife on your upcoming birth and experience of parenthood. That's so exciting.
Thank you. So, how did you start your journey on birth? As I understand it, I listened to another show that you were on that made me very much want to talk to you. As I understand it, you've had 8 children. Is that right?
I have. I've given birth to 8 babies, yes.
So you're an expert.
Yes, I on simply the basis of my own birth experiences and mothering journey, I would say that I'm an expert in birthing my babies, yeah.
I think that's important because a lot of people frame expertise in credentials more than experience. So when it comes to birth, what is your overall philosophy? If someone like myself is having a kid and is in that stage of like, I'm not quite sure what to do, or like it's the first child we're having, so we're, I noticed that in myself preparing, there's a desire to know or be prepared for every single scenario. But what is it that we, when we're having children, should actually be focused on? Or what is it we need to do to prepare?
Yeah, that's a really big question, I think, for us especially in this very complex, overly complicated world. I think in many ways, the biggest task ahead of a woman or family or couple who intend to have as natural and as spontaneous a birth as possible is really almost a process of unlearning and of kind of reacquainting ourselves with our intuition and our nature as mammals, as the animals that we are. And that's a tricky thing in a culture that is so highly mediated by technology and by, I would argue, many sort of layers of mind control and indoctrination that have pulled us away from the natural world and from the sort of beautiful simplicity of our bodily processes. And I think we have all been subject to a great degree of, I think, trauma-based mind control, actually, around birth especially. There's an enormous burden of kind of repetitive programming in the media, in all forms of media, really, that have instilled in us a very deep fear of birth, to the extent that most of us willingly or seemingly willingly volunteer to enter an institution that I would argue is perhaps the place that is the least optimal for having even a safe birth experience, I'd say. And that's, the hospital environment.
So I went into this knowing a lot about the pitfalls of the hospital environment because of the documentary I did on the issue of circumcision. And I even starting, or now going to be a father in August, although I've had people correct me before, I'm a father already, but we're just getting ready to meet face to face. I've noticed that I am aware of a lot of the things that can go wrong in hospital birth, but I did not have as clear a picture of what could go right in home birth or natural birth. And so I think a lot of people have a picture of birth that comes from TV and cultural propaganda of various forms that on some level, I would hope most people in my audience are aware, is not a truthful picture or an incomplete picture. But what does a natural, healthy, best possible version of birth look like for those people who maybe haven't seen that or don't know what that looks like yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, there is quite an enormous variety of possible experiences that fall within the realm of normal. Probably a much wider scope of what normal, even optimal, can look like than we've been led to believe in this culture. So to kind of sum it up, I would say that birth, in my experience, and I have birthed my own 8 babies, and actually I'm pregnant with my 9th baby right now.
Congrats.
Thank you. And I've also supported many, many mothers over the years, over the almost 20 years that I've been an independent birth witness or traditional birth attendant. And what I've come to know to be true is that birth tends to work best when it is least interfered with. Now, that term interference is probably sounds, very subjective, and it is. And what we're kind of circling around is this idea of what so-called normal spontaneous birth really looks like. And that shouldn't be a really complex question, but it is, because so very few of us have really encountered that, right? And birth is wild. Birth is a wild experience. And the more that, or the the more that mothers are supported, more is not quite the right word, the better that mothers are supported. When mothers are supported in a way that allows for them to have the sort of full scope of that experience with as little control and management as possible, I think the safer that birth tends to be. So the processes and procedures of industrial birth are, when you really start to delve into not just the scientific studies, of which, there are many, and there are lots of, I think, flaws in the way that science is conducted. But when you start to kind of overlay the scientific studies that are available on childbirth with the fundamental physiology of birth and how mammalian birth works, because mammalian birth is really very similar across species, right? Then you start to discover that industrial birth is really rooted in processes and procedures that are almost entirely arbitrary and that really are not based on evidence. In fact, what I found is that industrial birth is so profoundly arbitrary that it's almost kind of created its own sort of twisted internal logic. It's sort of formed its own almost absurd internal world that has come to really dominate so completely the public consciousness around birth. And, I mentioned this sort of idea of trauma-based mind control, and I really do believe that is what industrial birth is kind of rooted in. That's the sort of foundational thrust of industrial birth. It really is excuse me, in my view, a kind of a form of ritualized ceremonial abuse. And I know that sounds very extreme, but if you look at the fundamentals of how we understand ritual abuse, again, in the context of what constitutes physiological birth, health professionals really don't have any context for the latter. So, there's this story, this narrative that industrial birth is founded on evidence-based care, but I see it more as being rooted in a kind of liturgy, repetitive practices that serve to indoctrinate the mother and subsequently her baby into her new role, sort of her new identity, as part of this culture. And really, birth is always a form of initiation into a particular worldview. And the worldview that we are currently enmeshed in emphasizes our dependency on the supremacy and authority of doctors and of the state. And I think those two are very, very much connected. I see doctors and their influence as being kind of part of governmental control in many ways. So from the moment that a woman walks through the doors of the hospital, she is treated as an object. She's tagged with an identity bracelet. Most often she is given an IV port, well before there's any indication whatsoever that she may actually require IV fluids or intravenous medications. And this is in service to making her strange to herself in a way, of creating a sense of disorientation and of reinforcing this notion that a birthing mother is infirm. She's a patient at the mercy of those who supposedly have a far greater knowledge, understanding, and authority over her own body and her baby than she does. And from that point onwards, she has really no objective control over anything that takes place. Conversely, when women choose to decline that system and to stay home and to birth under their own authority, the entire experience is completely different from beginning to end. hopefully. And there are some issues there too, because midwifery has changed a lot. The sort of the face and the quality of midwifery has changed greatly over the past 40 years. So interestingly, midwifery has been effectively appropriated by the medical industrial complex in many ways. And what we see so much of now is midwives, well-meaning midwives, importing many of those same hospital attitudes and routines and procedures into a home setting, and so there's a lot of complexity there. But yeah, from the moment, like I said, a woman steps into the hospital system, she is being subjected to a range of interferences and interventions that begin, for example, just with the environment itself. She's subjected to bright lights and a constant stream of strangers coming in and out of her room, and even those factors, which may seem negligible, do have, especially when someone understands the chemistry and the hormonal structure and the physiology of the birth process. Even those seemingly small interferences have a profound effect on our ability to process the intensity of birth. And I don't mean in a conscious way. This is all happening on a biological level, right? And so just in terms of bright lights or strangers being in the room, our body's capacity to properly create and excrete the amazing concoction of natural analgesic drugs that not only make birth bearable, but even pleasurable in many cases, and which allow birth to proceed normally, is impacted. When a mother is under any form of additional additional stress, her body is receiving the message that she is not safe, and her birth process will often halt. And of course, failure to progress is one of the many justifications for the implementation of the use of so-called labor-enhancing drugs like Pitocin. And this kind of begins that cascade of interventions that many people are familiar with.
It sounds like, first of all, thank you for that answer. There's a lot of interesting things there. It sounds like that there is either the medical system is very bad at understanding people's feelings or emotions and the impact of their actions on those emotions, or intentionally bad at treating people well. One piece to the puzzle that might interest you, this is something I'd like to find the right guest for on a future episode, is that modern gynecology was developed by white doctors practicing on black slaves. That's actually, they had slave women who they would do things to, and that was how they developed a lot of the modern birth practices. So when you talk about people being treated like an object, it's like, oh, why would they treat people like property? Well, that's actually how it was developed. So since I fully agree, I noticed that in that system, it was some of the most stressful things in terms of planning a birth have not been the birth itself, but thinking about like, what if we have to interact with that system? Like, oh, well, I use the phrase transfer. Like, what if you have to transfer, or what if something goes wrong? And even reading birth literature, I'll be reading and saying, and this happens in the birth, and this happens, and then make sure to ask your doctor. And I'm like, no, like it's not going to happen. We're, just going to take that part out. But how do you handle the stress of a culture whose assumptions about birth are so fundamentally wrong? Because it seems like birth itself is a intense enough experience, but I noticed that it's difficult to have all of the feelings that I have around it while also like keeping an eye on this other thing out of the corner of my eye. Like, don't mess with me while I'm doing this, So how do the phrase I've heard, by the way, used for this in social justice circles is cultural stress. There's like a cultural stress from a culture that really does not understand certain issues. So how is it you handle that while also doing all the things that are required of birth?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I talk a lot with my clients about, and I work with women and families in person, but I also do a lot of coaching with women and families around the world. And that's the importance of kind of maintaining a certain degree of kind of mental hygiene when you're in the process of planning a birth, and really maintaining very strong boundaries, not only in terms of the kinds of conversations you're willing to have with friends and family who will inevitably have strong opinions about the choices that you may be making, but also really being careful about the kind of media that you allow yourself to be exposed to, because there is this really profound kind of constant low and high level propaganda that's at play at all times. And it's really interesting when you start to think about the kinds of risks that have been completely normalized in our culture, the kinds of risks that are encouraged. Like, for example, driving. I mean, almost every day we enter these little metal boxes on wheels, and we hurtle ourselves through space at, shockingly high speeds, and very few of us really think twice about the immense danger that represents, right? And in fact, driving is statistically far more dangerous than, I think even giving birth in a canoe in the middle of the lake probably would be. So, there's, I think, a certain degree of kind of counter-programming that we may actually serve ourselves well in sort of consciously taking on as much as possible. And the fact of the matter is, there is no risk-free option, in any of these situations in life and in birth. But I think I'm lucky in many ways, because I have been in this world for 20 years, and I've witnessed many births, and what each of those experiences has emphasized, including the experiences during which I have transferred with women to the hospital, is that birth is remarkably safe, especially when it's not being sabotaged and interfered with. And again, that runs very contrary to the dominant narrative, and I know most obstetricians would heartily disagree with me, but we're all coming at this from our own particular lens, and it's an interesting question, but I think preparing for a birth, even one's 9th birth, it does involve a leap of faith, and I certainly have moments, like every mother, where I'm, standing at the sink doing dishes, or, folding the clothes, and I'll stop and go, oh dear, what if this time something goes wrong? And I allow that, and I process it, and I, let it move through my body, and I acknowledge it, and then I ask myself, is there any reason to be afraid in this moment? Right now in this moment, am I safe? Is my baby safe? Yes. And then I, put that fear aside and carry on. And I don't think there's any easy answer to that question. We are really swimming in this sort of sea of fear, not only around birth, but a lot of other issues in the world that I think have a lot to do, again, with the media and with programming and with propaganda. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we are all susceptible to those sorts of influences, while at the same time we also have far more agency and power and choice than I think we're sort of led to believe. So I think it's important to kind of play with both of those ideas, and then to move forward and really focus on the outcome that we most want. Yeah.
So the outcome we most want, I want to come back to that question of what really healthy, good birth looks like. So when Christina, my wife, when she starts feeling it, and we're at home and we know we want to have the child at home, what could that look like? What is there something I should be doing to support her? Is there a particular feeling or mindset that she should focus on? You know, we've talked about, we're both trained in hypnosis. We've talked about doing certain things with hypnobirth. We've talked about water birth. And I think that the intention between both of us is to have as natural and free a birth as possible. We do have a midwife, but our midwife is free birth before. And I think that her desire there was she wanted one person supporting her in case she needed that kind of support. But I'm sort of trying to figure out, like, what, you know, since we're not doing the hospital birth, what could it, or would it be best if it was instead?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think that many people go into, plan a home birth or plan a free birth with certain expectations of what it might look and feel like. And the fact is that it's really not possible to articulate the incredible intensity of the birth experience. And it's also, and so I think in many ways, every woman is utterly shocked by how I can't even find the words. Intensity isn't the word, but it's maybe as close as it's otherworldly. It is mind-blowingly intense. And I don't really like to use the word pain, actually, because the sensations of birth, in my experience, go far, far beyond pain. Pain is a bit of a reduction, I think, that word. And when it comes to partners and how partners can best support the birthing mother, I think this is also really important to kind of understand, because you will be witnessing your loved one in a state of primal wildness like you've never ever, like you couldn't possibly imagine her to be. And there's something really exciting about that and amazing about that. And, you know, that's one of the aspects of hospital birth that, it's one of the things that hospital birth can't handle. I think this is one of the purposes, actually, of industrial birth, is that it can't allow women to reach that point because it's so powerful, and it's so kind of explosive that the environment just can't handle that. That's one of the reasons for the epidurals, the drugs, the this and the that. And, you know, so many women have so many stories about, you know, having these plans to, you know, enter the hospital and have kind of a wild hospital birth, which is very much a contradiction in terms. And what so many women experience is, you know, the nurse will come in and they'll have this immense pressure to submit to these drugs that will sublimate the wildness of birth. And so, in my view, that's one of the incredible gifts of foregoing the institution and of staying home, is that birth is a profoundly spiritual, transformational experience. And so we don't really live in a culture that has a lot of space for that kind of explosive, wild, primal, gritty, just emotive kind of transformational experiences. And so, just in my own life, I gave birth to my first baby when I was 20 years old, and I thought that I was prepared. And I had this idea that, that it was going to be kind of a cakewalk for me, because I was especially brave and especially, I heard a lot of stories about women who had a hard time birthing, or who found birth very intense or had long, difficult births. And, I figured that this would just be no problem for me because, I'm kind of special and, and all of that. And what I found is that the process of birth, while of course, obviously, it's intensely physical. I mean, there's a baby literally passing through your body, and that in and of itself is just, it's kind of even hard to really conceive of. Even for me, having been in this world for so long, being pregnant with my 9th baby, sometimes I stop and think, oh my goodness, really? Is that actually how it's going to work? But even more significantly, birth is, it is this spiritual initiation, as I see it. And it is a process of stripping away every layer of self. So I almost see the physicality of birth as having a psychological purpose, if that makes sense. So it's this sort of cyclical, circular, kind of throbbing physicality to it that takes the birthing woman to a certain plane where she feels like, this is it, I'm done. I can't do it anymore. I don't know where I am. I don't know who I am. It's so very difficult to describe. And then it requires that she move through that layer into another stage of complete unknowing. And that part is really scary. I mean, the physicality of birth is intense, but the emotional and psychological journey through this process is very, very confronting. It really is. And so what I've found is that it's really not until a woman allows herself and surrenders to this incredible force that kind of almost returns her to the most primal, animalistic state that she could possibly embody, that her baby can then pass through her into the world. And so for you, Brendon, it's going to be perhaps really challenging to witness your partner in that state. But at the same time, it's also an expression of the most intense beauty and power that you will ever have an opportunity to witness as well. And so, yeah. And, like I said before, there are lots of variables sort of within that paradigm. And in some cases, birth happens quite quickly. And in some cases, birth can take several days. And that can also be well within the realm of normal. And so I think, again, we have quite a distorted view of what's sort of allowable when it comes to birth. And in my own case, I'm really so grateful that I listened to my own intuition as a young 20-year-old woman. And I ended up really having to work quite hard to seek out the kind of support that I knew would serve me. So I ended up, in the end, after a bunch of, kind of wrong moves, I ended up hiring an illegal underground midwife who I knew would really be able to fully hold the energy of my birth. And looking back, my own first birth experience, I failed to fall within the boundaries of what would have been considered acceptable, not only in the hospital, but also if I had been followed or if I had ended up hiring a regulated midwife, because my birth was sort of out of bounds. I remained pregnant until I was almost 44 weeks. So that's a big issue in the birth world, birth timelines. So many women are, a huge percentage of women are induced because their babies are supposedly late, when I think that is another, very faulty construct of the system. And then when I finally did, my waters released prior to feeling any sensations, and my water remained opened without anything happening. I mean, everything was happening, but I wasn't feeling strong sensations at the time. And so for about 16 hours, I waited with my water open, and that within the system, even not just the hospital system, but again the regulated midwifery system, would have been disallowed. I would have been transferred to the hospital if I had been under the care of a regulated midwife. And then when my birth process finally did really begin in earnest, it was a 3-day long marathon. And I spent over 7 hours pushing my baby out into a birth pool. And that again would have been, I would have been risked out for that reason. I would have been encouraged to transfer or abandoned by my regulated midwife. And so, I have a lot of experience with the wide range of normal that birth can encompass. But then at the same time, there is sort of there's a very kind of normal process that can take a short amount of time or a long amount of time. And really what it comes down to primarily is whether or not the mother is supported by people who absolutely love her, people with whom she feels completely comfortable and familiar. And as few people as possible is usually a good idea. There's always exceptions, but I think in general, having as few people in the room as birth is not a party. It's not a spectator sport. I think a lot of women feel sort of tempted to, invite their neighborhood or their best friends or their family to the birth. And in general, birth is a very, very intimate experience as well. And the energy and the sort of the tonal quality of the space in birth is ideally very similar to the kind of energy that goes into conceiving a child. And so we want to create that sense of intimacy and warmth and privacy and safety. Those are really, really, really important. And again, if you think about the hospital environment, that represents the antithesis of the kind of intimacy and energy that that is really optimal for a birth to unfold in the best way, or the most ideal way, physiologically anyway. Yeah. That
sounds like an intense experience, and also very exciting on some level.
It is. It's so exciting. And, I try to make sure that I say this wherever I go, whenever I'm talking about birth, which is, all the time. And that's that I absolutely love giving birth. It's the most exciting experience that I've ever gone through. And that, too, is knit into our biology. Birth is supposed to be exciting and blissful and joyful and gorgeous and just mind-blowing. And it really, really is. It really can be, again, when the context and the environment and the support system is right. It really is.
Yeah. I notice one barrier to letting go, or a belief that might get in the way, or a thought, which is, am I doing this right? Because I know that that's something that has come up for Christina, and it's come up for me, because we haven't done it before. And we want our child to be happy and healthy. So there's that, am I doing this right? And I'm noticing that a lot of the medical propaganda is based on the idea that you might be doing it wrong, that they have the right way and your way might not be the right way and you have to do it their way. And it sounds like the view that you have is that it's almost much closer to the act of conceiving a child, and that if you're thinking, am I doing this right the whole time, it won't be as fun as if you just completely let go with someone you trust. So how is it that we can let go of the thought, am I doing this right, and instead have that full experience?
That's such a good question. And I mean, again, I'm kind of pulled back to the memory of my first birth. And I have to say, I think when I talk about birth, I think a lot of people assume that I'm that I have some kind of special, intuitive connection, and that I'm, a very, easygoing, calm person. And actually, I think of myself as really deeply neurotic, to be honest. And, and I absolutely got to that point in my own first birth, or not even got to that point, but much of my first birth experience, and probably my subsequent births too, in many ways, were sort of punctuated by that very thought. Am I doing this right? And actually, the frequent thought that came to me, especially in that first birth experience, was, how can this possibly be right? I'm absolutely terrified. This is beyond what I could just even imagine. I feel like I'm going to die. Is my baby it was and I'm really grateful actually that I did have that amazing, wonderful, illegal underground midwife who became a mentor to me actually present, because she continuously and very, very simply throughout this, 3-day long affair of my first birth, I'll never forget her, just how steady her presence was, and how she kept just very simply confirming to me that, yeah, this is right. This is how it is. And so in kind of a paradoxical way, it's actually not a problem to feel like you might be doing it wrong when you're in the experience. It's not a problem to feel scared or even terrified. And there's sort of something about allowing yourself to feel that way and also accepting that you feel that way that will sort of help you to just move through it. I mean, it's just something that we have to move through, right? Like, there's no way out. There's no way out, And certainly transferring to the hospital is an option, but that's not a way out either. Like, this baby is going to come out of your body no matter what. And so it is true, I would say, that the more a woman can allow herself to surrender to the intensity of the experience, the easier it will be in a way. But that doesn't also mean that it's wrong to feel the intensity and to feel the fear as well. I mean, all of it is normal. And that's the thing about birth too, and that's what's so kind of fascinating about it to me, is that you can resist. Like, resistance is sometimes part of it. For many of us, it's part of it. And I think in my own case, this is exactly why that birth was 3 days long, because I was afraid and I was resistant and I couldn't believe that this was really what was happening, and it was all too much. And still, my baby was born and my baby was healthy and I did it and it was all right. And so I think in some ways, especially for a first birth, sometimes the crucial factor is really whether or not a mother has the kind of support that allows her to feel it all, allows her to have it all. Because, again, what's so fascinating to me about birth is that the experience encompasses every possible human emotion. There are points in every birth where the mother is giggling and it's funny and, there's a lot of humor to it. And then there are other points where there's just deep grief that comes up and that has to be processed. And then at points, the mother may feel rage. And this is something, again, that, you as a partner, Brendon, will have an opportunity to hold and to kind of mirror and to experience along with your partner. And it's everything. Birth is everything. And all of it is okay. So yes, remaining calm, surrendering as much as possible, very important, very positive. But there's no way to do it wrong.
That's a really helpful frame. I on the podcast I first encountered your work on, I remember you talking about it as being like a medicine journey or a plant medicine journey. And I can see why, after hearing how many different feelings come up, and then of course them being something that's okay and that you just are with until they pass. It's also sounds very similar to meditation, and that in meditation, if thoughts arise, we don't suppress them, but we also don't hold on to them. We just allow them to be there. And, if you're with them enough, they will change. Which sounds like birth also. If you're with it enough, that baby is going to come out. It will end. Exactly. Yes. I mean, in my experience, birth is kind of the most profound form of meditation, and for me anyway, blows every plant medicine journey that I've experienced out of the water in terms of its profundity and immensity and and possible teachings, really. Yeah. And actually I would say too, as far as advice that I give to the women that I'm working with and the families that I'm working with and my clients is that one of the most important things that we can do when we're in the midst of the birth process is to really allow ourselves to be in the moment, and to remind ourselves that the birth is actually so beautifully designed in these sort of wave-like forms, right? Our body is moving through this sort of wave-like process, and we're always given at least a few seconds, at least a moment or two of relief between each wave of intensity. And women tend to get into trouble, emotionally, psychologically, into a little bit of trouble when we find ourselves casting our minds back into the past. Like, how long have I been in this? I've been doing this for 5 hours. It's too much and I'm too tired. That's a little bit of trouble. And we also get into trouble when we start to cast our mind into the future. Like, how much longer? How much longer is this going to be? I can't do this for another, 10 hours. Can't do it. None of that exists. All that exists is one sensation. One single sensation. All you ever have to do is just survive this one sensation that you're in, and then you get to rest. And this is such a potent kind of teaching, I think, for life itself. And I think, I notice in myself and lots of other people that we often have a hard time, like, accepting the gift of silence and of rest. And I've noticed that a lot in birth too, that we tend to kind of carry into the period of calm whatever intensity we were just feeling a moment ago. And it's so important to kind of practice. And this is a practice that comes through the experience of birth itself. But it's good to kind of, have this thought, and to be able to maybe sort of draw on this thought when you're in the midst of it. And that's that all you have to do, again, is survive that one sensation, and then as soon as it's gone, accept the rest. Accept the rest and be in that period of quietude and really sink into that period of quietude, which can be infinite in that moment.
And then when the next wave comes, it's just one. There's only ever just one. So I find that helpful.
Birth is a meditation. I want to ask some really specific questions because I know that that one of the things that has triggered me at times or taken me out of the process of preparing for birth or pregnancy has been when specific things I didn't know about or understand, like what the right thing to do was, came up. So, I mean, one of the first ones was even, obviously this isn't directly birth related, but pregnancy related, was ultrasound. So there was like a little bit of pressure around that because, well, we want to know that the baby is okay, but we can't see the baby. So there was like a question around, is that something we were going to do? And we ended up not doing it. But the question that was there of like, we want to know that the baby is okay. And I could feel that the reason for doing it was not actually any kind of research thing or medical necessity. It was like the feeling of like, I want to know the baby's okay. And so are there things like that during pregnancy? I mean, like, first of all, I don't think most people are even aware that ultrasound is something controversial, or they think of it as a normal part of pregnancy as opposed to something that's highly unnatural that was developed in the last 50 years. So maybe for people who are not sure what I'm talking about, like, why would you not? I don't understand. Because it's also a social media thing of like people will post their ultrasound photo and like, I don't even know if I'll post photos of my child after they're born on social media, or if I trust those companies with that. But first, what is your thoughts on ultrasound or those things along the stage of pregnancy that people do to like feel safe or that you're quote unquote supposed to do during the pregnancy?
Wow. Well, first of all, I'm really surprised and kind of delighted, I have to admit, to hear that that you and your partner have foregone ultrasound, Brendon, because that is a very rare thing in this culture. And you're absolutely right; it has been completely normalized as, not just sort of a regular facet of prenatal care, but an essential. Like it's shocking. I'm sure you've come across this perspective that people are shocked to hear that you haven't had an ultrasound. Like, what on earth? How could you not? Don't you want to know that? Again, don't you want to know that your baby is okay? And the fact of the matter is that despite what people are told by their doctors. I hear this all the time. I see people, friends of mine, acquaintances, like you said, posting ultrasound images on social media saying, we had our 20-week anatomy scan and our baby is super healthy and everything is great. And, that hurts my heart because, in fact, ultrasound cannot confirm that a baby is healthy. And that's one of the real misconceptions around that technology. And so... despite all of the amazing gadgets and gizmos that we have available to us, the truth is that there is no technology that can confirm that a baby is healthy and well. And ultrasound is frequently wrong in its assessment. Ultrasound has also statistically is not related to, there's no statistical relationship between having an ultrasound and having a positive outcome, which I think is interesting, and most people aren't aware of that. But in addition, I think ultrasound has many, many risks that people are not made aware of by their health professionals. And so, there are numerous animal studies that have shown that ultrasound is correlated with miscarriage, actually, with lower birth weights, even with organ and tissue damage. And so, in my view, the risks of ultrasound definitely do not outweigh the benefits, and I don't ever have ultrasound. I don't have my babies exposed to ultrasound or Doppler, which is also ultrasound technology, and in some cases can be a stronger and more potentially damaging form of ultrasound. And yeah, again, we live in this culture where there's this sort of fantasy of safety, and a kind of ethos of safetyism, which I don't think is actually based in rationality, but rather custom and sort of ritual, and the difficult truth again is that there is absolutely no way to know if a baby is healthy or well at all. It's always there's always risk involved in bringing a child into the world, and on a kind of philosophical level, that is inescapable as a parent. That constant knowledge that something could happen to our children that we have no control over is ever present, and that's life.
It's really, yeah, it's really interesting how now that we're having this conversation, I'm noticing how many things that parents do are based in fear. And one of the things that I also notice is that if something goes wrong and you could have done some intervention or thing that maybe supposedly would have prevented it, well, you should have done that and the fault is on you. And if an intervention is done that causes a problem, or even causes a problem you can't trace back to the intervention, like it creates more stress in the mom and changes her emotional state and then causes something, well, we were trying to do everything we could for your benefit, so it's not our fault. So there's a sort of discourse and double standard there where it's the fault of someone doing something naturally if something goes wrong, but it's not the fault of someone doing something unnaturally if something goes wrong. So bit of a double standard there.
It is an immense double standard. And, I what I have found over the years working with families who are making choices around their pregnancies and births that fall outside of the so-called mainstream is that often when I kind of dig in with them around fear and these kinds of choices that have to be made, often what comes out is that the primary fear around choosing to birth at home or choosing to birth outside of the allopathic system, the primary fear isn't so much that their baby might die. It's in many cases more so that the blame and judgment that they fear from society. And that's really it's legitimate actually, and it's quite heartbreaking because in my sort of natural birth circles, it is true that if a baby dies in the context of a free birth or a home birth, there's immense judgment placed on the mother, usually the parents, for making the so-called irresponsible choice to forego birthing in the system. Whereas if a baby dies in the hospital, inevitably the doctors did everything they could, right? And so,
Right.
that is one of the potential risks of this kind of choice, and that's true, I think, not just in birth as well, but Yeah, but when it comes to education and any path that deviates from the so-called norm.
It's true. Yeah, it's true of so many different social paths. Like if you go to college and get a degree and try to join the system and it's not fulfilling, well, you tried, you did the right thing. And if you go into business for yourself or take an artistic career and fail in that, well, you should have had a backup plan. Like you should have gone to school. It's like the system has no punishments if you do what it says but are unhappy as a result of it. But it has a lot if you try to go outside.
Yes, and it's unfortunate. It's unfair. And I think, again, all of these decisions come down to what kind of risk we are willing to accept. And the judgment and indictment of other people. I mean, even when your birth works out beautifully, there will be people who have, who disapprove and who have strong judgments about one's choices. And I think that, again, is one of the risks of choosing to birth outside of these conventional systems. And I'll say too that another significant risk of choosing a different kind of birth than most people is that others tend to feel judged by that choice. And it can feel, in some contexts, in some environments, in some communities, it can feel alienating. And this is a funny thing to say, but experiencing birth as blissful and transformational can be challenging socially in some cases, right? And so there's all kinds of interesting risks, not just, the sort of obvious risks that people would initially think about, but it does put us in. It just creates a very different experience, and I see that shifting actually, because more and more people are starting to question the allopathic path and mainstream birth choices, and more there are communities being created around these kinds of lifestyle choices, I guess they would say, and that's really exciting. And I think what's happened throughout the world over the past year has contributed to that a lot, because we're seeing kind of a real exposition of a lot of this brokenness. Yeah, manufactured brokenness, I would say.
I'm fortunate to be in a subculture where it would be the weird choice to do hospital birth. But I think with all the weird COVID restrictions they had during, oh my God, I'm not going anywhere near that. But that cultural aspect is important, because, very often when people make these decisions, they're making them on unconscious emotional factors like that. And so now that I'm talking about it with you, I can kind of hear when someone says, well, aren't you worried this will happen? And if you were to get into well, why would it be bad if that happens? Like, what do you mean it'd be awful if it's something? It's like, well, but why specifically? Because if you're saying it would be bad because of something about the child, but what would that mean if, when you get really chunked down on the underlying reason, it's like that they would feel something was wrong with them or someone in their life might not like them, or, and that's, even if the fear is the same, the underlying thing behind it might be different for each person. So for one person, it might be that their friends would judge them, and for another, it's their mom would judge them, and for another, it's something completely different. Do you when you work with people around birth, do you get into do you do sort of a psychological, working with them around this kind of stuff, or are you more focused just on the, is there a way, I mean, is that something that you get into, or is that something that you have a method for?
Absolutely. Actually, I think those are the most important things, really, what is it that we really want, and why do we want this, and what's the subconscious programming that's, creating these fears or these desires. What's really going on under the surface, I think, is some of the most important aspects of how we plan for a birth, and how to avoid self-sabotage too, because that's a really, really powerful and important aspect of what it is to kind of, I mean, this is a loaded term in some ways, but how we manifest the birth that we want, right? Because self-sabotage is very, very powerful, and it's very common, and I think often women unconsciously sabotage their births in part to maintain a certain story, a certain family story, or to maintain, acceptance in a certain social group. And there's a lot going on there. Absolutely. Yeah.
Now I'm noticing my own stories and like, oh, I should probably change some of these.
Yeah, it's really deep stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm at a point in my life where I choose the kind of births that I do, which I would call a family birth. I give birth in my home with my husband and kids. And it's another day in the life, and it's also the most magical experience possible, both of those at the same time. But I have come to view that choice as the safest path and the most conservative path too. So, people ask me sometimes, when do you think that home birth might become normal? And like, for me, it's completely normal.
Right.
I couldn't possibly even consider, like, go to the hospital to have a baby. Oh dear, that just sounds terrifying. So yeah, I mean, it is all very relative. But like I said at the beginning of our conversation, Brendon, there is a lot of sort of deprogramming that I think needs to, or that can be chosen to be done, and a lot of it is really deeply subconscious stuff. And there's a lot of just family baggage that contributes to how we perceive birth, and the experiences that we had ourselves of coming into the world. So there's intergenerational trauma that is at play in a really deep way in all of this too. And so when I'm working with clients, we delve into all of that, and we look at our unconscious commitments and what it means to take responsibility, and what's kind of going on under the surface, and how the quality of our relationships plays into all of this. And it's really work that it touches every aspect of our lives. And birth is always an initiation, a form of indoctrination, even into one particular worldview or another. And so I think a really important question is, like, what sort of values and what kind of world do you intend to initiate your child into? Because every single aspect of our emergence in the world has such a profound effect on who we are. And I think we really have very little cultural comprehension of who babies are, really, and of how they function, or really any appreciation for the fact that babies emerge from their mother's bodies fully perceptive and fully feeling and fully engaged with the world around them, and exquisitely sensitive to everything that is happening to them. And if we did have an appreciation for any of that, there is just absolutely no way that we could possibly condone or stand back as babies continue to be routinely abused, and I would say even tortured by medical professionals. And actually, I want to say too that I watched your documentary a few years ago, and I really appreciated it so much. But it is horrifyingly common still for, babies' necks to be twisted and for them to be violently pulled from the womb with their umbilical cords severed, prior to their full emergence, which is just so incredibly dangerous on so many levels. And this, not only puts them at risk of respiratory distress, because of course the umbilical cord is their lifeline, but also deprives them of receiving their full complement of blood volume. 30% of their blood volume is transferred from the placenta to their bodies immediately after birth. Just on and on and on. Attachment theory is really, really interesting to me, and I think it is so much to offer, and it's so important. But attachment theory, from what I've seen for the most part, has sort of a major blind spot in that it kind of glosses over the birth experience itself and tends to, from the material that I've been exposed to, kind of begin at, like day 3 of infancy in a way, An infant maternal attachment is so important, of course, but what lays the groundwork, what really forms the foundation of our relationship to our babies, is the birth process itself. And of course, when a mother has been traumatized by the birth experience, she is not able to fully attach to her baby either. So it's a co-creative process. It's not a one-way thing. And so, it can be really tricky to talk about this because there's so much, guilt and shame that, women especially feel around birth. But yeah, I think what attachment theory often misses is the actual birth experience itself and a child's very first experience of life in the world. Those first few hours and the actual process of birth itself is so very important. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought all that up because I'm a big believer as well in the birth experience is very formative for who people become. And I was going to bring up the placenta as well. So I've heard that cord cutting is unnecessary and harmful, and wanted to know from you what the alternative was. I'd also heard that, if the baby has it around its neck, you're supposed to do something, but also that maybe that's overblown or it's not in every situation you handle it. So that's another situation where I don't, I could see that happening and then having that moment of like, oh, what do I do? Do I need to change my plan to save the baby? But also like, what do I do in the normal situation? Like, does it come off naturally? Do I do something later? So I'm curious to hear your whole perspective on how to handle the cord and placenta.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the nuchal cord, which means the cord wrapped around the baby's neck, is remains one of the sort of central scapegoats for justifications for all kinds of unnecessary drama and intervention. And yeah, in most births that I've attended, the baby's cord is to some degree wrapped around the baby. And actually, contrary to what most people believe, this is very, very protective. It's actually a form of kind of biological brilliance, because when the cord is loose and kind of flopping around, then that can lead to cord prolapse, which is when the cord emerges from the mother's vagina before the baby is born, and that can be very dangerous. And so, when I see a baby that's, tangled up in their cord as they're emerging, it's like, oh gosh, what a smart baby. That's great. We don't have to worry about the other thing, right? And so the umbilical cord is filled with a substance called Wharton's jelly, and what that does is that it allows the cord to be twisted and turned, and even sometimes, in some cases, babies can somersault themselves into creating a true knot in the cord, and often that's not an issue either. And so the cord is very integral. It's designed to be that way. And so, yes, I often see babies with cords around their necks or cords kind of, stylishly kind of draped over shoulders and things like that. And yeah, it's very. I've never actually seen. I've never experienced this to be a problem at all. And often, if the baby's head emerges and the cord is wrapped around the baby's neck, then often the baby's body can still be born without an issue. And once the baby's body is born, then the cord can just simply be unwrapped, and it's not really an issue. So it's certainly not something that I would anticipate to ever be a problem, and I've never witnessed it to be a problem. So yeah, I would just sort of be prepared for that possibility, and to know that it's well within the realm of normal, and that it is even like I said, a protective thing. So it's a little bit hard to explain, but I would say once your baby's head is born, if you see a cord wrapped around the baby's neck, don't at that point touch the cord or do anything, because if you do, then that can kind of tighten it in other ways. So instead, just allow your baby to be born, because what can often happen is the baby's body can still emerge even if the cord is kind of a little bit tight. And once your baby's fully born, then your wife, probably your partner, can unwrap your baby, or you can do that, and it's just not something to be fearful of. Yeah, it's very normal.
There was some question too between us of when the baby came out. Am I the one who's catching the baby, or is she going to bring the baby directly up to her chest? Or I don't know if you have a strong opinion there or a suggestion. It's one of those things where I want to be there as much as I can for her, and if that's the way that I'm there, or if she needs me to just allow her to lift the baby up, or there's a lot of questions like that where I'm like, I don't know what the way we should handle that is, and also I'm aware that some of it might change in the moment. So how do you handle questions like that?
Well, one of the beautiful things about a spontaneous physiological birth at home is that the mother will be free to move in the way that she feels the need to move, and to take whatever position she feels most comfortable with. And I get a lot of questions about, what's the best position to be in? And the answer to that is exactly whatever position feels most comfortable for the mother, right? And so, I have given birth to one of my babies lying flat on my back, which is quite strange and not something that most people would assume would be the natural position that a mother would want to take at home. I've given birth to a couple of my babies on my hands and knees. I've had a couple of water births, and I think it's so wonderful that you're having these conversations with your partner, and what happens in the moment may be completely different than what either of you anticipate, right?
Sure.
And and I think it's great to just sort of be open to whatever your partner feels is right in the moment. And I very rarely, as a birth attendant, catch babies, because it's not really my role. And so, what I love to see is mothers catching their own babies, or mothers inviting their partners to catch the baby. And what I do think is important is obviously having these open conversations, and then for everyone who will be present at the birth to really appreciate and understand that whoever ends up first catching the baby really understands that it's so important to immediately hand the baby to the mother so that they can have that first encounter together. Yeah.
And then I want to come back to the question of the placenta. So if we're leaving that attached, how long do we leave it attached? And then what do we do with it afterward? And I have a story about the afterward, because when I was touring with my film and I was traveling around and talking to people, I met someone who, I don't know if she was a doula or a midwife or what, but she would take the placenta. She had a company that took the placenta and turned it into supplement capsules for the woman afterward. And I, in my 20s, I was like, is that good? Like, do you want to give me some? I'll try it. Like, and she was like, well, there's a chance you might grow breasts if you take it. And I said, nope, never mind. I'm out. I'll pass. So, I mean, we even talked about like, I don't know, like, is there some benefit to that? I have no idea. So I'm curious what you think we should do afterward with it. And then is there a point at which we should do something to disconnect it, or if it should just stay attached for as long as possible? Like, what's the right thing to do there, best thing to do there?
Yeah. Okay, so let's start kind of from the beginning in a way. So your baby will emerge from your partner's body, and in that moment, all of the intensity of the birth will fall away, and you will be immersed in this kind of golden spell of joy and gloriousness. And you'll be meeting your baby for the first time. And at that point, the placenta will still be inside your partner's body. And I like to kind of prepare my clients to really just fully experience that as much as possible. And so we're not even going to think about the placenta. Nothing else exists other than meeting your baby and, getting to know your baby. And usually at about, half hour postpartum, 45 minutes, the mother will start to feel kind of crampy and uncomfortable. She might even be a little bit shocky, and that's also within the realm of normal. So, as she's meeting her baby, her support people really want to be really attuned to how she looks and how she's feeling. And if she's really, if she's bright-eyed and focused on her baby, that's really wonderful. If she starts to feel kind of, a little bit pale and faint, then you want to, get her reclined and give her water and give her a bite to eat so that, she's stabilized and feeling well. But when she starts to feel crampy and uncomfortable, that's a really good sign that it's time for the placenta to be born. And so usually what I do is I don't like to encourage mothers to move too much. So we want to kind of keep her in one place and, maybe put a big bowl. If you have a big bowl handy or a big pot, then releasing the placenta into a bowl or a pot just in the bed or in the place where she's birthed is a really good idea. And so sometimes the placenta takes a little bit of kind of nudging to come out. And so the first time she kneels or squats over the bowl to release the placenta, it's going to take some effort. And that's not going to sound very good, but it's not going to hurt at all. So you can give her some encouragement there. And if the placenta doesn't come readily that first time, then put the bowl away, lie back down, nurse the baby. Nursing really helps to release the placenta. So you want to try to get breastfeeding established prior to. You might take a couple of tries. And when the placenta emerges into the bowl, then the birth is complete, but your baby is still attached to the placenta. And so again, when I'm working with a family, we don't even, once the placenta has emerged, then you've kind of moved into another stage. And I don't talk about separating the baby from the placenta for at least a good hour. Because again, I think the longer you can keep baby and placenta attached, not necessarily the longer the better, but what I like to see is baby and placenta attached for at least an hour or two, right? Now there are lots of differing opinions on when the optimal time is to separate the baby from the placenta and what the best way of doing that is. So, in some cultures and according to some people's opinions, the placenta is a spirit unto itself and sort of represents, a lot of significance in the whole process, and I would agree with that. And so for some people, it's really important to follow what is sometimes known as a lotus birth process, and what that means is not severing the cord at all, and instead allowing the the cord to separate from the baby's abdomen entirely spontaneously. And so what that usually involves is packing the placenta with salt and various herbs, and there's lots of sort of different ways of going about that. But because the placenta is a piece of our bodies, you don't want to just leave it as is for several days, because it can take up to a week for the placenta, for the cord to detach naturally from the baby. So if that's a choice that you want to make, then you're going to want to go through a kind of preservation process with the placenta. Now, I had read about this 20 years ago when I had my first baby, and I loved the sort of philosophy behind this. It sounded very spiritually connected for me, and that was my plan. And after about 6 hours, the cord was really cold and limp, and it was constantly kind of touching me, and it was on the baby, and there was this big bowl of placenta there, and I had to, if I needed to go to the bathroom and I wanted to take my baby with me, I had to have someone carry the bowl. And honestly, Brendon, it became kind of unappealing, and I sort of abandoned that, and I ended up cutting my baby's cord after several hours, and I felt at that point totally at peace with that, and that was fine. And so if you end up waiting for several hours, then the blood, there's really no more blood pumping through the cord and the placenta. Nonetheless, I would still in that case recommend clamping the cord on your baby's side, because even after a few hours, in very rare cases, there can be a very slow bleed from the cord, which can compromise your baby's health. And certainly you do want to clamp the cord if you end up severing the placenta from the baby, within a couple of hours. So it's easy to find little plastic sterile cord clamps from any midwifery supply outlet. Probably if you're working with a midwife, she'll have those handy. Or you can use a tie of some kind, new shoelaces or dental floss or something like that, So yeah, that's kind of a bit of an overview of lotus birth. And, there are some families who just love that process. And the advantages, I think, of choosing a lotus birth are that it really does keep mother and baby in bed, because it's very awkward to, carry this placenta bowl around. And so that can be a real benefit. Also, this might sound funny, but I think it's quite true that doing a lotus birth can be kind of a bit of a natural filter for who ends up wanting to, be around mother and baby. Maybe more conservative people who are not as comfortable with birth placentas, nakedness, that kind of thing, might be deterred from visiting, and so that can be maybe a benefit for some people. But it does add sort of an additional considerations, right? And it's not necessarily the most practical option. Now, I would say personally, I think that keeping baby and placenta attached for at least a couple of hours is great, and anything after that is just great. Unless you have strong spiritual connection to the idea of the placenta releasing naturally, I don't really see any physiological downsides to separating baby from the placenta after a couple of hours, and so that can be done really anytime a family feels like it. And I have cut my baby's cords a couple of times, but what I've ended up adopting as kind of our family ritual is actually burning the cord. And for
I've
me,
heard about this.
Yeah, so I love burning the cord, and it's my personal preference, and I prefer that for a couple of reasons. So, for me, it is actually a very emotional process, separating baby from his or her placenta, because I see it as really representative of the full completion of not just the birth experience, but my pregnancy, it's a form of kind of saying goodbye to the old iteration of our family configuration and of, fully welcoming this baby into our family. And so what burning the cord involves is just that. And what I've done is I've had some beautiful boxes made, and often people use these boxes to burn the cord. And so it's an open wooden box with grooves on all four sides of the box. And the cord is draped across the box in one direction, usually lengthwise if it's a rectangular box. So the cord is draped over the box and fit into the two grooves on either side. And then I use two beeswax candles that meet in the middle and that sort of burn the cord from both sides. And I really love this because it just adds kind of a magical sort of ceremonial feel to it. The fire is so elemental, birth is so elemental. I love sort of bringing fire into my birth room. Fire is it's so potent, it's so raw, it's so primal. Human beings have such a profound relationship with fire. So, having these two candles, burning while I'm snuggling our newborn baby, it has a sort of a coziness and a sense of sort of fun and excitement and sweetness to it. And, I have a big family, so my older kids are always involved in my births. And so they're on the bed and gathered around, and like the kids are holding the candles, and, there's like a sense of a little bit of risk to it too, like don't burn the house down, guys. And it does take a little bit of time. So it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to burn through the cord. And during that time, we kind of, we glory over this baby. We talk about the birth. There's just a real sense of sort of family togetherness, and there's so much excitement too. Like when the cord gets close to breaking apart, it's like, oh, it's gonna happen, and then oh, it happened, and our baby's here, and our baby's been released. Our baby's released from the placenta, and it's done. There's a sense of completion. And on a practical level, what burning the cord also does is it cauterizes the cord on both sides. So it's completely sterile, it's sealed, there's no need to use clamps, and there's actually a sense of sort of ease to it. So in a way, it's more elaborate, but also in another way, there's a simplicity to it that I quite like. So yeah, there's lots of different ways of treating the cord, and all are fine. And I don't think that apart from the spiritual significance to waiting several days without severing the cord at all, I think once a couple of hours or a few hours have passed, then whatever you decide to do with the cord is healthy and good. Yeah. Good
to know. I really appreciate that in-depth explanation, and I'm gonna have to talk with Christina about what we'll do and think about it. I don't know exactly why. We do know we want it to remain attached for long enough for the baby to get everything that the baby needs. So, by the way, you were talking about children experiencing and having their full presence there in birth. I think our child has it already, because our baby will move when my voice is heard. So it's already recognizing that and understanding, like, mom has different physiological cues when I'm near and things like that. I have one other really specific question, and it's I don't know if this is just like, because you were talking about misconceptions and unlearning. Like, this is one of those like things that we've picked up that I don't know if it's a misconception or real or not, but there being mucus in the nose or eyes when the baby's born that you have to clear out. Like, what is the thing that needs to happen there? Is that, because again, like, I'll hear these things and like I get the medical system version of them, which includes the like, oh, what you need to do about that. And I'm like, okay, maybe you're giving me the full story, but maybe you're not. And so I'm asking you to hopefully give me the actual full story.
Well, I could certainly give you my opinion on that, Brendon. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, I think this is one of the big areas that where my perspective differs from the medical system. So I don't know if I mentioned before, but one of the standard procedures in the hospital is to routinely assault, I would say, a newborn baby immediately after birth with a bulb syringe. So that's a small sort of rubbery instrument, plasticky instrument with a bulb on one end and a point on the other, and the ostensible purpose of this is to clear mucus from the baby's mouth and nose. And so at the moment of birth, most often, a newborn baby's first experience is to have this long implement shoved up both nostrils quite quickly and violently, I would say, and then also put down their throats also. And I think this is not only unnecessary but very painful and very traumatizing. And again, this is a child's very first experience of life on Earth, and that this happens, within moments of their emergence. And I think as a society, we've been so kind of inured to this kind of torture, often thanks to our own trauma, thanks to sort of, again, monotonous mind control of the media and sort of doctor as hero, savior indoctrination, that we see this not only as normal but as beneficial. And I think it's very, very misplaced. I don't think it's necessary at all. And when you think about it, the process of moving through the birth canal and of emerging from the mother's vagina actually compresses the baby's head and empties the nose of most of the any sort of deleterious amount of mucus. And so that process has already happened as the baby has emerged from their mother's body. So that it's actually a very natural kind of clearing of the mucosal passages as the baby emerges. But it's still very normal for a baby to come into the world a little bit snuffly and kind of gurgly, and this is, again, well within the realm of normal. And my perspective on the transition that a baby moves through to calibrate to the outside world and to take their first breath is probably quite different from how a physician would see it. So there's a really important distinction between a baby that isn't breathing yet and a baby that is healthy and alive and still receiving oxygen from the umbilical cord. So again, I would say that most babies that I've witnessed being born don't emerge immediately screaming and breathing. Most babies actually require a period, a few seconds, even a minute or two, of space in order to figure out where the heck they are and to become embodied. And there's so much fear around that transition, and there's so much terror when a baby is born with a bluish color or not breathing and screaming right away. And I think that fear is, again, really misplaced. So, I see a lot of blue babies, and that, to my mind, is a baby that is fully oxygenated. It's not outside of the realm of normal for a baby to have blue coloring, even for a baby to be born without good color, to be born floppy. I think because we live in this world where that is seen as very dangerous, we don't really have any context for it. Like that is not really allowed in this culture, and yet I've seen it many, many times. And so I think even in home births, often midwives are, in my view, far too quick to exert some kind of to fix and to kind of hero the situation, when I think more often than not, most babies would actually be better served by being allowed some space to come to of their own volition. So, in fact, one of the babies that I have witnessed being born that had the sort of so-called lowest APGAR score, that seemed the most compromised, was my own youngest child. And actually he was born completely white and completely limp and quite lifeless. And it was a very interesting experience for me, because I actually kind of blacked out for a few minutes, or a few moments anyway, a minute or two. And my husband very gently tapped me on the shoulder and had to say, "Yo, wake up, get your baby." Because I had birthed him on my back, and so he'd kind of like come out onto the bed, and I was like, it was a very difficult birth, long story, and I won't go into all of that, but I remember sort of hearing my husband's voice and thinking, oh right, there's a baby. And I sat up and I looked between my legs, and there was this white baby that really didn't seem alive at all. And I picked him up and I brought him to my chest. And I always birth naked, because I think it's very important, actually, for my baby's very first experience of his or her mother to be my skin and not, a nylon sports bra. And also in terms of just the safety factor, one of the things that will trigger a baby's urge to become alive is the exchange of pheromones and hormones that they smell on their mother's skin. And for me as well, being naked is very protective, because I want to be absorbing all of my baby's smells and chemicals so that my body receives the correct triggers to stop bleeding and to calibrate appropriately as well. And so I think actually being naked is protective for both mother and baby. So anyway, I brought my baby up to my chest, and there were another few moments of kind of waiting, and then my baby became alive. And I think it was such an interesting experience, and I think very few babies are given that space to kind of come into their bodies in a very spontaneous way. And what I've come to know too is that in the absence of any kind of underlying physical problem, most babies are not only equipped to survive the birth process, but to really thrive. It's actually a process that is healthy, is life-giving, the birth process itself. And again, that's not really a perspective that we hold as a culture. There's this sort of sense of like, at any moment, something could go wrong. And that's not to say that doesn't ever happen. I don't want to downplay those situations where, things do sometimes go wrong. But again, that's the same in every situation in life, right? So anyway, I'll get to the point here, Brendon. But I think, in my experience, I have never, ever once used a bulb syringe. I don't think it's necessary. In fact, I think it's counterproductive. And what it can do, when you think about it too, just in a practical way, this pointy thing being shoved into the baby's nose and mouth, that can actually push mucus farther down into the baby's body. It can also create a vasovagal response, like a trauma response. It can be really very painful and traumatizing. And I just don't think it's necessary, because birth works so beautifully well. And so in the cases of my own babies and babies that I've witnessed being born, if they do have a lot of mucus that remains, you can take your hand, the mother can take her hand and just clear the mucus away, right? Like the way that we do when we blow our nose. That's all. That's all
Right.
that generally needs to happen. Sometimes mothers like to use their own mouths, and that's an option too. It's never really been something that has been intuitive for me. I've always found that just using my hand and kind of clearing any kind of snot or mucus away from baby's mouth and nose is practical and easy and And there's never been an issue with that. So yeah, it's another one of those things that I think we really overcomplicate with by doing far more than needs to be done in most cases. Yeah.
Well, I find this fascinating. I'm sure I could talk to you for another hour, but I know we're coming up on a lot of time here now. So is there anything else that you want to add before we finish? Anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about or make sure to add?
There's nothing really that I can think of. And yes, we certainly could talk for hours and hours, and you can tell I can go on about this for forever. But I just want to emphasize that I'm just so excited for you, and that birth, that it's, well, I'll quote, I'll quote Harriet Hartigan, who was a photographer and who said this years and years ago, and it's sort of become one of the sort of themes and mantras of the home birth, natural birth movement, and that's that birth is as safe as life gets. And I think that is very true, and birth is also just so much fun and so joyful, and I think we're all it's nice to give ourselves permission to approach birth from a sense of, with a sense of excitement and joy and curiosity. Yeah.
That's a good note to end on. If people want to find you, work with you, have you help them with their birth, where can they do that?
Yeah, thank you. So I am still, believe it or not, I haven't quite been officially banned yet, still on Instagram, and that's at Bauhauswife. So that's BAUHAUSWIFE, like Bauhaus.
I'll make sure it's in the show notes.
Thank you. And my website is at freebirth.ca. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much, Brendon. This has been a lovely conversation, and all the best to you and your family.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to The Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone else who would also like it, and then go on whatever platform you listen to the show on and leave a positive review. If you want to support the show directly, go to brendonmarotta.com/show and subscribe there. Paid subscribers get special unreleased bonus material and live events that are only available to them. Once again, that is brendonmarotta.com/show. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all later.